Now let's move on to the demographic transition model. This is a model that students love and College Board loves, so you're going to need to know it. It seems like a lot. This is the model down below, and it seems like, oh my gosh, what in the world is happening? Don't worry, we're going to go to each of the 5 stages individually, and once we cover it, you'll be golden. You're going to know it like the back of your head. So what does this model even do? What's the purpose? Now, for some context, declining death rates, declining mortality rates, and declining fertility rates are not the only reasons for why populations grow. For one, we have immigration and emigration. That's a reason why populations grow. If declining mortality rates and declining fertility rates occurred at the same time at the same rate, the size of population would not change. If you have very high death rates, very high birth rates, they're going to cancel each other out. The same thing for very low birth rates and very low death rates. They're going to cancel each other out, and you're not going to see a high population growth. You're going to have a very low natural increase rate, kind of close to zero. The replacement rate would be what you're at as well. Now, what is crucial is the timing for mortality and fertility changes. When do death rates shrink? When do birth rates shrink? And what are the rates that they shrink? The model, the demographic transition model, explains when these population death rates decrease, when the birth rates decrease, when they increase, and what the rates are for these changes as well. And each country goes through periods of population growth called demographic transition. It is not an economic model. And you're probably saying, okay, of course it's not an economic model. We're not talking about economies. We're talking about population. However, this confuses students because on their tests or on the AP exam, they're going to go in with the mindset that this model explains economies and economic changes. No, we're going to say how economic characteristics are typically found in certain stages and how they impact population change. But this model does not explain economies at all. So don't get that in your head. If College Board asks you about this model, particularly about this model directly, they're asking what happens in stage 4. They will almost always give a diagram of it. In the 2024, this year on the FRQs, they gave an FRQ on the demographic transition model, and they gave the entire diagram. And they just asked questions like, what stage is this happening? What causes a country to go from stage 2 to stage 3? And it's very, very straightforward questions that you can just kind of look at the model and answer. So they don't expect you to memorize this model completely. However, you should, and you should understand this model because there's a chance they may ask you a question on the AP exam about population, and you can relate it back to the transition model. So let's go through each of these stages individually. On the right here, I have the chart from the model. It shows the birth rates in yellow, the death rates in green, and the natural increase rate, well, population growth, in blue. And then I have a population pyramid of what a country would look like at this stage. So the stage names, like high stationary, you don't need to actually know. But you should try to learn them because they might make it a little easier in explaining what's happening. So high stationary, just by looking at the chart, we see that population growth is low because we have very high death rates and very high birth rates. So we have high birth rates, high death rates, and a low natural increase rate because these are going to cancel each other out. When you have a lot of people born and a lot of people dying, you don't have a lot of growth, but you don't have a lot of decline either. No country is in stage 1 anymore. So they're not going to ask you what kind of country is in stage 1 on the AP exam. They're not going to ask you that because no country is in stage 1. There are certain regions and certain groups of peoples and tribes that exhibit these characteristics where they have very high birth rates and very high death rates. And this is typically due to isolation from globalization and healthcare increases and contraceptives and that sort of thing. They're living more traditional lifestyles. So for an example, there's a group in East Africa that lives in very harsh environments that most people would not want to live in, and they have very limited access to healthcare. And this leads to their very high mortality rates, particularly among children. And as we've seen in areas where children die more and when the infant mortality rate is higher, people are going to have more kids to particularly ensure that they have more that survive to adulthoods. They maintain very traditional lifestyles that include high birth rates, and these will offset the high mortality rates, leading to very low population growth. Before the Industrial Revolution, most of the world, the entire world, was in stage 1. The UK, the US, those European countries, those were the first countries to enter stage 2 of the demographic transition model. And in stage 1, we typically see the lowest life expectancy. And if you think about it, when the Industrial Revolution came out, people were moving to cities. People were having access to different foods, manufactured goods and services that increased the standard of living. No wonder the life expectancy went up. No wonder the death rates decreased. That's what kind of stage 2 looks like. So let's look at that now. early expanding. This is the first time that the populations will expand. So we see high birth rates. The birth rates do not change from stage 1 to stage 2. The birth rates will remain high. We typically see decreasing death rates, exponentially decreasing death rates due to health and medical advancements. We see a high natural increase rate. This is the highest it will ever be because we are experiencing exponential population growth here. So look at this population pyramid. We're seeing a lot of population growth here. The Industrial Revolution led to countries entering stage 2 in Europe, North America, Australia, and East Asia, particularly China. The medical revolution occurred in the 20th century, and this led to countries in South America, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, essentially the rest of the world, to enter stage 2. Life expectancy increases as the infant mortality rate and the maternal mortality rate drops. So as less people die, more people are going to be living longer, so the life expectancy will increase. Urbanization also begins. People are moving from rural to urban areas, and urban areas are beginning to grow. We saw that with the Industrial Revolution as the factories and the major job opportunities were located in the big urban areas like London. Sub-Saharan Africa is the most recent to enter stage 2, and they're almost entirely in stage 2. There are a few exceptions of countries south of the Sahara, like South Africa, that's in stage 3, but they're not in stage 4 and they're not in stage 5. So these are some examples of countries. You don't need to bother learning what country and stage match up. You don't need to know what stage every country's in, but it's nice to know a few examples. So as examples of stage 2 would be Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bolivia, Niger, Uganda, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Angola, and Yemen. So this is Uganda. This is the population of Uganda in a 220-year period, and we can see that it is exponential population growth. So they are definitely in stage 2 of the demographic transition model. And then on the right, we see rural and urban residents and populations. And we can see that in years where population growth has inevitably occurred, we see urban population growth increase. And as more people live in urban areas, of course, less people as a percentage will live in rural areas. And that's what we've been seeing here, rural to urban migration. Now, late expanding. What happens here? The birth rates, the yellow, start to decline. Death rates will continue to decline, and we still see population growth. So birth rates, this is the first time birth rates will decline. Death rates continue to decrease. They're not decreasing exponentially, though. We see an increasing natural increase rate. That sounds really strange. An increasing population growth. It's linear population growth. It's no longer exponential growth. Urbanization has occurred and is most prevalent now, and the effects of urbanization are starting to emerge here, like the cost of living going up. Women are working more. There's more contraceptive access. There's more education and education access, particularly for women. We see increased cost of living, limited space, crowded living, higher crime, and other factors that will decrease the birth rate. When the mortality of children is not as high as it was, parents will adapt to this environment and choose to have fewer children because they have less children and more of them will still survive to adulthood. So they don't need to have as many kids anymore because the infant mortality rate has decreased. The economy is undergoing structural changes, and this makes children less economically valuable. We particularly see child labor laws being enforced, so children can't even work. So they can't be seen as an economic value as well. We don't see a high agriculture presence as well in these countries. We see manufacturing be a dominating feature of the economy. And even if there is agriculture, it's more business oriented. So we don't see family farms anymore. We see large-scale agriculture corporations taking over. So some examples of countries in stage 3 are Mexico, Brazil, Thailand, India, Colombia, South Africa, Egypt, and the UAE. Guest workers are typically prominent in stage 3 countries. So we'll see that in the UAE particularly. So this is of Mexico. Proportion of seats held by women in national parliament. So this is showing increased political participation and activity of women in Mexico. And over time, this has increased. We typically don't see high female participation in politics and roles in the government in stages 1 and 2. And in stage 3, that starts to change as women get access to education and employment opportunities like in politics here. Let's look at stage 4 now, low stationary. Actually, I want to contribute this a little bit. When women have more job access and they're working more and they're prioritizing their careers, like they're in high stressful jobs like in politics, they're going to choose to have fewer children, have less children. So that's why we go back and see that the birth rates are going to decrease as a result. All right, now let's move on. Low stationary, stage 4 here. We can see that the natural increase rate is starting to level out. We're seeing population kind of increase, but then it's leveling out. It's not really increasing a lot. It's not really decreasing a lot. We see that the birth rates and death rates continue to decrease. The birth rates will decrease, the death rates will decrease slowly, and they're going to eventually level out and become very similar with one another. And they will cancel each other out. So we see low birth rates, low death rates, low population growth. They're going to be close to the replacement rate, which is a 2.1 total fertility rate, which is an NIR of about zero population growth. Death rates will remain low due to advanced healthcare systems, improved living standards, and better nutrition. Life expectancy is also high, and mortality rates for all age groups are low. Changes in societal values and norms, like the acceptance and promotions of smaller families and different gender roles, will influence family planning decisions. Higher levels of education, particularly for women, are correlated with lower fertility rates. It's about at this time that we see more women in education than men, and that's what we see here in America, which is a stage 4 country. Education promotes career aspirations and delayed marriage and delayed and fewer childbearing. So some countries in stage 4 as the United States, Canada, Russia, China, UK, and Australia. So this is charts in Australia. It's showing female and male employment. And as we can see over time, female employment has increased in both full-time and part-time sectors at high amounts since 1982. And the total fertility rate in Australia has decreased since 1982. And we can connect those factors together. Now, stage 5, declining. People say that this is a hypothetical stage. It's not. It definitely exists, and we can prove that with countries that exist today in their population levels. So let's look at this. Birth rates continue to decrease. The death rates don't really decrease, but they don't really decrease as much. So they're going to be higher than the birth rates. The birth rates decrease more than the death rates do. So when you have greater deaths and less births, you're going to see population decline. You have a negative population growth. You're below the replacement rate, below a TFR of 2.1. You may have a negative natural increase rate. This is where you see from the effects of urbanization, changing social and cultural conditions, healthcare and education advancements. Those are the reasons for why the population pyramid kind of looks like an upside down pyramid now. You have a lot more elderly people and a lot less younger children and young adults. You might need to manage the needs of an aging population with robust healthcare systems because old people break their hips more. You might see a need for pension systems and social security programs. You'll see a higher dependency ratio that places significant economic strain on the working age population and the economy. You have fewer workers for the high amounts of retirees and the higher amounts of older people that cannot work. They're not in the healthy conditions to work, or they've already worked 40 years and they're ready to retire. They want to collect their pension or their unemployment or social security. So when you have fewer workers, you have more open positions and less economic competition. You're going to see lower economic productivity and lower economic growth. Countries may explore innovative policies to support families and to encourage fertility rates. They may not want their population to decline. They don't want their economic productivity to decrease. So they're going to put in policies and incentives to encourage population growth. They may even adapt to changing demographic realities. And this could lead to flexible work arrangements, making affordable housing programs, and comprehensive family support systems. They may put in more generous paternity leave policies or tax incentives for having more kids. Some examples of declining populations is Japan, Iceland, Greece, Spain, Germany, Estonia. Western Europe is where, not Western Europe, Eastern Europe, where, Spain, Italy, Greece, those countries are located. That's where we see the greatest population decline. Now, I mentioned this term dependency ratio, and you may not know what this term means. So let's discuss it for a little bit. So the dependency ratio is the age-population ratio for those not in the workforce and those typically in the labor force. It's used to measure the productive population. So if you have a high dependency ratio, you see an aging population here. So you can see here, high dependency ratio puts an economic strain on the working age population here. So that means we have a lot of elderly, not a lot of youth. So the youth have a lot to do to make up for the fact that they're losing a lot of workers. A low dependency ratio is typically found in growing populations. schools with lots of youth compared to the elderly. There's not a lot of pressure because you have a lot of people open to fill the jobs needed, and that creates a lot of competition for jobs. It's better for economic growth, and it puts a lower burden per person. Now let's talk about the epidemiological transition model. And you're looking at this chart now, and you're probably like, Eason, we just talked about this. We just talked about the transition model. No. We talked about the demographic transition model. We're going to look at the epidemiological transition model, which, yes, describes population patterns of fertility, life expectancy, deaths, but leading causes of death as well. That's kind of the main difference here. Is we're looking at why people die and the rates that they're dying. We're looking at diseases and allergies and sickness and obesity and cancer and all kinds of stuff that cause people to die, and how that changes as a country develops and how that impacts the natural increase rate. It correlates with the DTM. So a country in stage 4 on the demographic transition model, like the United States or Canada, is also in stage 4 of the epidemiological transition model. No country is, of course, in stage 1, and both models are indicators of a country's social and economic development over time. And this bullet point is very important, because if College Board asks you what the DTM and ETM are used for, what purpose they serve, this is a very good option that they may put on the multiple choice that may throw a lot of people off, especially the economic development, because it's not an economic model, but you can find correlations between economies and economic conditions between countries and their population change. All right, let's go through each of these stages. And this is where the stage names become a little bit more important, especially for understanding what's happening here. So stage 1 is pestilence and famine. What happens in stage 1? Famine, of course, and pestilence, like viruses. So you see famine, lack of food to support the population. You see waterborne illness from contaminated drinking water, like cholera, as well as nutritional deficiencies, like scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C. We see infectious diseases, both viral and bacterial infections, be a very large influence on deaths, like the Black Plague, for example. When the 14th century, when the Black Plague wiped out a third of the population of Europe, those countries were in stage 1. And that disease, just because it spread so quickly and there was no medical advancements and sanitation put in place, they also had no idea how the infection worked, it led to a lot of people dying. It led to a pandemic, which is an infection at an international scale. We see animal attacks also occur. We see malaria, salmonella, and other diseases caused by animals, particularly malaria is a big one, that cause deaths. Malaria is caused by mosquitoes. Salmonella is typically caused by undercooked raw chicken. When you cook chicken, when it's raw, you want to cook it to at least 165 degrees. War and conflict are causes of deaths in these countries as well. Childhood diseases like measles and the whooping cough, as well as just high infant maternal mortality rates for a lot of reasons. We just don't know how to give birth safely. And that leads to an overall very low life expectancy. Moving on to stage 2, we have receding pandemics, and you can probably assume that means our international pandemics are decreasing, and that is something that we see here. Remember, in stage 2, the natural increase rate is high because we're seeing exponential population growth. Birth rates are high, and death rates are decreasing exponentially. We see mortality rates fall. Now, we still see people dying of certain conditions like infections. Typically, when they die from infections, they're due to viral infections like the flu over bacterial infections because of advanced sanitation and medication that can be used to treat bacterial infections. So this covalent compound right here that you see is penicillin. It's an antibiotic. It's used to treat bacterial infections. Antibiotics are used to treat only bacterial infections, not viral infections. So if you go to the doctor with the flu and say, hey, I need an antibiotic to make this fever go down, they're going to think you're a fool because that's not really going to do anything. And in fact, it may make your condition, or at least the symptoms, worse. We see epidemics occur, viral epidemics. These are different from pandemics. Epidemics are more domestic. They stay within one region or within one country. They're not international. As mortality declines, which we can see here, the death rate declines, average life expectancy increases steadily from about 30 to 50 years. With more people living, the life expectancy increases. Population growth begins to be exponential. Look at this map here. So we see the likelihood of deaths caused by infections during 2012. And in our stage 2 countries, of course, our infections are going to be the most prominent. Infections start to decline in more developed countries like the United States or the United Kingdom or China or Russia. Improve living conditions and standard of living, sanitary water, sanitary services, improved nutrition, better personal hygiene like brushing your teeth, medical and healthcare advances in research. All of these factors are what causes mortality rates to decline. We don't see a lot of improvement in healthcare per se. So like we're not seeing major breakthroughs in like cancer or anything, but we see germ theory, and we see promotions of people washing their hands, maybe some vaccinations being distributed and used, medications access. That's what we're seeing primarily here to cause these death rates to decline. We have a better understanding of infections with the acceptance of germ theory and the adoption of antiseptics like Neosporin, which you put on cuts and scrapes and stuff. If you fell off your bike before and scraped your knee, your mom probably put that on your knees. And then we have pasteurization as well. We have lower fertility rates resulting from all this. We don't see them just yet. That's why our birth rate are still high. But sooner we will see fertility rates drop and longer birth intervals. But we do see better infant survival. So this does occur during stage 2, is our infant mortality rates will drop. We also see our maternal mortality rates drop as well. Now, stage 3, this is where we see degenerative and man-made diseases. A man-made disease is a disease that we essentially cause, and these are oftentimes due to our lifestyles or genetics. So infections decline, especially viral infections. We see major healthcare and sanitation advances. We see mortality continuing to decline and eventually approach stability at a relatively low level. So death rates aren't decreasing exponentially. They're still decreasing, but at low rates. Mortality is related more towards cardiovascular disease, which is diseases with your heart, cancer, violence, accidents, as well as substance abuse, whether this be drugs or alcohol. Again, these are more lifestyle diseases or diseases caused by how we live our lives. So diabetes and allergies also emerge. We see urban living becoming more prevalent than ever, which is associated with more sedentary lifestyles. We see changes in diets, as well as increased exposure to environmental pollution. We see continued economic growth, particularly in these urban areas, that lead to higher living standards, better healthcare access, and more resources for chronic disease management and prevention. The healthcare facilities that we're developing in stage 2 have expanded and become greater as the cities have developed and more research has been conducted. The healthcare systems improve and there become greater amounts, particularly in rural areas as well, where healthcare is a little more scarce, and they see a focus on managing chronic diseases and providing preventative care. So early on in stage 2, they focused on infections. In stage 3, now they're going to start looking at more chronic diseases. So here we have a map of food allergy preferences around the world. And countries that see food allergy prevalences are, for the most part, in stage 3. There's some exceptions, but countries that are in stage 3 or higher are where the food allergies are located the most. Now we're going to move on to stage 4, which is delayed degenerative and man-made diseases. Now, why is it delayed? Well, a trend we've been seeing since stage 2 is that the life expectancy is continuing to increase. And a lot of these diseases that we're talking about are lifestyle diseases. So what we're seeing is that we have found ways to delay the symptoms or the prevalence of these diseases, not the elimination of them. So let's look at this. Mortality rates are low and stable, and life expectancy is, of course, growing. Deaths from infections are rare, and we see more deaths from chronic conditions, as well as delayed mortality. Life expectancy increases significantly due to advancements in medical care, healthier lifestyles, and improved healthcare systems. Populations in stage 4 have life expectancies above 75 years for the most part. We see chronic diseases associated with aging and life experience. So these diseases are more prominent in elderly individuals than the youth. Stuff like cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, osteoporosis, obesity, stroke, chronic kidney disease, and cirrhosis. There's a delay in degenerative diseases because of operations, medicine, better and preventative diets, knowledge, etc. We know now that we're in a stage 4 country in the United States that smoking causes cancer. When the United States was in stages 2 and stage 3, we didn't have all this knowledge and research on smoking. So that led to a lot of deaths. Smoking still leads to a lot of deaths, but we have a lot more preventative measures in place to try to prevent smoking deaths, or at least delay the effects of smoking. Healthcare access, the availability and affordability of health insurance, more specialized care. So you can go see an ear, nose, and throat doctor. Or if you have an ear, nose, and throat problem, you can go see a dermatologist for a skin problem, a podiatrist for feet problem. We see pharmaceutical advances, elderly care, and these are all major contributions to the delay of diseases. So here we can see this is the United States chart, the leading causes of death. And for the most part, it is heart disease, which is cardiovascular disease. And then we have cancer. Then we have lower respiratory diseases. We actually still see accidents as 5% of the causes of death. We see stroke as 5% of the causes of death. Alzheimer's, which is a elderly disease as well. Diabetes. And it takes us a good bit to get to our first viral infection, which is only 2% of deaths in the United States is the flu or pneumonia. Pneumonia is actually a bacterial infection. Fun fact. So we can actually treat that a lot of times with antibiotics. But a lot of pneumonia strands now are antibiotic resistant, which brings us to stage 5, which is the reemergence of infectious and parasitic diseases. So when we have antibiotic resistant pneumonia, we would classify that as stage 5. So some examples of stage 5 are going to be due to evolution. Infectious disease microbes, remember, viral infections are not living. Bacterial infections are living, but both of them contain nucleotide sequences. So they can evolve and establish a resistance to drugs and medications and insecticides, pesticides, that sort of thing. HIV has shown significant resistance to various antiretroviral drugs. We have treatment and it has improved. There's no cure yet for HIV. And we see new strands develop, and the virus has the ability to integrate into the host genome and make it persistent as a global health challenge. Antibiotics and genetic engineering contribute to the emergence of new strains of viruses and bacteria. Drug-resistant strains of the Plasmodium parasite and insecticide-resistant mosquitoes challenge control efforts to treat malaria. Malaria has been around forever, and we found various ways to treat it and eliminate it in certain areas, but we see that there are new parasites and new strains of malaria that are resistant to the drugs we have, so we have to develop new ones as a response. Poverty is also a cause for stage 5. We see infectious diseases more prevalent in poor areas. We see deindustrialization occur in stage 5. People are moving out of the cities. Manufacturing is not prominent anymore. So deindustrialization occurs. So all those factories, all those infrastructure that was used for industry are abandoned. They're most of the time not redeveloped. And that's kind of been the trend. We've just started realizing that maybe we should redevelop some of this abandoned and deindustrialized land. But in those areas, we see unsanitary conditions. It's very dangerous, and people who live there are most likely poor or in poverty, and they don't have the ability to afford drugs needed for treatment, like antibiotics. We also just see increased connections and globalization. We see advancements in transportation, like air travel, that makes it easier for an individual infected in one country to bring that disease or condition to another country, even before they exhibit symptoms. We have a lot of medications that will relieve or even eliminate symptoms while you still have the virus or whatever you have. So this, you see COVID, I put COVID on the side here. Hopefully YouTube doesn't flag this video, but COVID would be a great example of a stage 5 condition because it's been resistant to almost all the drugs we have. We have very little knowledge on the type of virus type of SARS virus that it is. So it's led to a lot of deaths. So this is an example of just increased connections. We have a mosquito that has been prevalent due to global travel and urbanization. And it's caused a type of fever, dengue fever, I don't know how to say it. It's a fever, guys. Fever is not normal because people have been spreading it because they're bringing it from their destinations. All right, so let's do some classification here. What stage of the DTM best fits this description here? We're just going to say the stage number. We don't have to give the name. So crude birth rate and the crude death rate are equal. This is when the natural increase rate is really low because the births and deaths are canceling each other out. So that's going to be stages 1 and 4. In stage 1, you have a really high crude birth rate and crude death rate. And in stage 4, you have a very low crude birth rate and crude death rate. And so your natural increase rate, your population growth is going to be very low. All right, next one. Crude birth rate is the highest it will ever be. That's in stage 2, and that's when we see our exponential population growth. Linear population growth is in stage 3. We start to see the population level out in stage 4, and then it declines in stage 5. So stage 4 and stage 1, very low population growth. Stage 2, exponential population growth. Stage 3, linear population growth. Stage 5, declining population growth. Urbanization begins. Urbanization begins when, of course, people are moving to cities. They're moving from rural areas to urban areas. And we've seen this historically start as a result of industrialization or manufacturing. And that typically occurs in stage 2. The next one, dependency ratio is high. That's when we see a lot of dependence, a lot of pressure on the youth to fill positions previously held by workers that are now retired or elderly or dead. There's just a lot of pressure on the youth to sustain the economy. And that's typically found in aging populations, elderly populations. So that's stage 5, declining populations typically. So the next one is crude birth rate and crude death rate have the highest difference. That is going to be in stage 2, when the crude death rate drops exponentially and the crude birth rate doesn't drop, it doesn't really increase, it stays really high. Infant mortality rate starts to drop. That's what causes a good part of the life expectancy to increase, as well as the crude death rate to drop in stage 2. Suburbanization begins. So we know what urbanization is. That's the movement from people from rural areas to urban areas, and that occurs in stage 2. Now, what about suburbanization? When do people start moving out of the city? Now, this is something that College Board could ask, and something that most books, most videos don't actually cover. We start to see the suburbs develop and suburbanization to occur in stage 4. That's typically what we see here. That's when countries are at the replacement rate. People are getting single-family homes in the suburb with 3 or 4 bedrooms, and they have about 2 children, which is very close to the replacement rate. All right, let's do this again, but this time with the epidemiological transition model. So let's do the first one. Sanitation improvements result in a rising life expectancy. We see that really in all the stages except stage 1, but this starts in stage 2. Sanitation is prevalent as the improvement in stage 2. Healthcare is more stage 3. Life expectancy starts to drop. When does it start to drop? That is in stage 5, when the crude death rate exceeds the crude birth rate. Deaths related to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. That is a laundry list. When are these most prevalent? Well, chronic is obviously going to be stages 3 or 4, and when they're most prevalent, that's probably when stage 4, when they're delayed. Cancer starts to become prevalent. It's not saying when it's most prevalent. This is saying it's starting to become prevalent, and that's going to be in stage 3, the emergence of degenerative diseases. Mutations in bacterial DNA result in pesticide resistance, resulting in famine from crop shortage. So we can automatically look at this, and it says mutation in DNA. It's particularly bacterial DNA. Bacteria cause bacterial infections, and when we see evolution occur and they have resistance to our known technology, that's going to be stage 5. Antibiotics start to develop and become widely used. That's stage 2. That's what causes the death rates to drop. Malnutrition is prominent. That's in stage 1. That's why the death rate, that's one of the reasons death rate is so high in stage 1. And then we have deaths related to alcoholism. These are when they're most prevalent. That's probably going to be stage 4 as well. We see substance abuse, alcoholism, all of those lifestyle deaths start out in stage 3, but they become most prevalent in stage 4. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out, and it costs $0. I have some free resources for you in the description down below if you'd like to use them. If you have any AP Human Geography related questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below the video or send me a message on Discord. I'll see you guys in the next video, though. Adios.